I'm going to tell you a story that haunts me to this day, a story that still keeps me up at night. I was in my 20s when it happened, and at the time, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It all started when my friends and I decided to take a weekend getaway into the woods. The plan was simple: head to a secluded cabin, away from the noise of the city, for a few days of relaxation and fun. Little did I know, those days would turn into a nightmare that would never leave me. We found the cabin online, tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. The listing promised a rustic experience, complete with wood-burning stoves, mountain views, and complete solitude. It sounded like the perfect place to disconnect from the world. My friends were all excited about the trip. We packed up, loaded the car, and drove for hours, leaving behind cell service and any sign of civilization. As we neared the cabin, the road became less paved, more rugged, and the trees began to press in around us. I remember thinking how beautiful it all was, how peaceful. But there was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. The woods seemed alive, as if something was watching us, but I shrugged it off. We were just a group of friends going to have a good time, right? The cabin was everything we had hoped for. Charming, rustic, and remote. It had a small porch, wooden beams, and a big stone fireplace. Inside, the atmosphere was cozy, the kind of place where you could curl up with a book and forget about everything else. But there was a strange feeling about it. The air inside felt off, like something wasn't right. But as always, I dismissed it. I was with friends, after all. What could possibly go wrong? The first day passed without incident. We spent our time exploring the woods, cooking, and sitting around the fire, laughing and telling stories. But as the sun set and the dark, moonless night settled in, I began to notice something odd. The sounds of the forest were strangely quiet. Normally, there would be the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, but there was nothing. Not even an owl. Just complete silence. It sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. That night, we went to bed early, tired from the day's adventures. The cabin was small, so we all slept in the same room. We kept the lights on for comfort, but around midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, it was just a faint scratching noise, like something dragging across the floor. My heart started pounding in my chest. I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, getting into something outside. But then the scratching stopped, and I heard something else, whispering. Soft, unintelligible whispers, as if voices were coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. I froze. I didn't want to wake anyone up. I convinced myself it was just the wind, the old wood of the cabin settling, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me," the voice whispered. It was a woman's voice, desperate and filled with pain. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to call out, but I couldn't move. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the whispering continue, growing louder. "Help me! They're here!" I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted upright, heart racing, and turned to wake my friends. But when I looked around, the room was eerily silent. My friends were still asleep, oblivious to the voices I had just heard. I stared at them for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The whispers had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But sleep never came that night. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to my friends. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I convinced myself that it had been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That day, we decided to take a hike up the mountain behind the cabin. We packed a picnic lunch and set off, hoping to take our minds off the unsettling feeling in the cabin. The hike was beautiful, and for a while I was able to push everything to the back of my mind. We made it to the top of the mountain by midday, and that's when things started to take a darker turn. While we were enjoying lunch, one of my friends, Sarah, pointed out something strange in the distance. It was hard to make out at first, but then I saw it too. In the trees below us, there was something moving, a shadow, darker than the rest of the forest, moving quickly through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It was as if something or someone was watching us. We stood up to get a better look, but the figure was gone. Just like that, disappeared into the dense woods. We all looked at each other, unsure of what we had just seen. Sarah, who had always been the more adventurous one, suggested we check it out. I didn't want to, but I didn't want to seem like a coward either. So we made our way down the mountain towards where we had seen the shadow. As we got closer to the trees, the air seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere heavy. We reached the spot where we had seen the figure, but there was nothing there. Just trees, rocks, and the sounds of the wind. My skin crawled as I looked around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. We all agreed it was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we were being watched. Later that evening, when we returned to the cabin, things only got worse. The whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the cabin. I could hear a woman crying, begging for help. It was unbearable. I rushed to wake up my friends, but once again they heard nothing. I tried to explain, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. "I think it's the cabin," I said. "Something isn't right here." That night, things escalated. Around midnight, as we sat in the living room trying to figure out what to do, the door slammed shut on its own. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the room went completely dark. When the lights came back on, we saw something we will never forget. On the walls, etched into the wood, were strange symbols, carved deeply into the surface. They looked ancient, like some sort of ritualistic markings. And in the center of the floor, a blood-stained handprint appeared, as if someone had pressed their hand there in desperation. We were terrified, paralyzed with fear, but there was no time to think. The door creaked open slowly, and that's when we saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the doorway. It was covered in what looked like dirt and blood, its eyes hollow, its skin stretched tight against its bones. It was the thing from the forest, the shadow that had been watching us. I don't know how we managed to escape, but we ran. We grabbed our things, bolted out the door, and didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we reached the nearest town, where we called for help. When the police arrived, they found nothing. The cabin was still there, abandoned, but no trace of the figure or any sign of the horrors we had experienced. I haven't been back to those woods since. I don't even know if the cabin is still there, but I've heard rumors from locals about strange disappearances, about the cabin being cursed. I don't know what happened that weekend, but I know this much. Whatever was in those woods, whatever was in that cabin is still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to stumble upon it.
Next story.
I can still remember every detail of that weekend trip like it was yesterday. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a few friends, a cabin in the woods, and a break from the chaos of our daily lives. We didn't know it would be the start of something that would haunt me forever. We were a group of 5. Me, my cousin Sarah, her boyfriend Mark, and our friends Jake and Emma. Mark found this remote cabin online. It was cheap, secluded, and described as a peaceful retreat away from the distractions of the world. We were all in our mid-20s, young and adventurous, looking for a little quiet in the middle of nowhere. The drive out there was beautiful, almost idyllic. Rolling hills, dense forests, and the kind of isolation that seemed perfect for a weekend getaway. The air was fresh, the trees towering above us like something out of a fairy tale. When we finally reached the cabin, it was everything we'd hoped for and more. A small, rustic log cabin, sitting at the edge of a vast forest, with only the occasional chirp of birds or rustling of leaves breaking the silence. The cabin itself had an old, worn feel to it, but that only added to its charm. A large stone fireplace sat in the center of the living room, and the furniture was all mismatched but cozy enough to make you feel at home. We spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking, and exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small stream nearby, and we spent some time down by the water, laughing and joking around. Nothing seemed off. That night, after a few beers and some stories by the fire, we decided to head to bed early. The plan was to get up at dawn and hike through the woods, maybe try some fishing in the stream. But as I lay there in the darkness, in the quiet of that cabin, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything I could place a finger on, just a creeping sense of something being wrong. I tossed and turned, trying to shake it off, but then I heard it, a soft, distant scratching noise, like something was dragging along the walls of the cabin. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. It wasn't a branch scraping the windows or an animal outside. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I held my breath, waiting to see if it would stop. It didn't. The sound grew louder, like something or someone was trying to get in. I tried to call out to the others, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was just the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. After what felt like an eternity, the scratching stopped. I waited for a few moments before I finally got the courage to move. I quietly slid out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, who was sleeping next to me. I crept to the door of the room and slowly cracked it open. The hallway outside was dark, just as it had been when we first arrived. The other rooms were all silent. I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the worn wood floor. I made my way toward the living room, hoping to find some explanation. Maybe one of the others had heard it too. But when I reached the living room, there was no one there. The fireplace had long since died down to embers, and the room was bathed in an eerie, flickering glow from the dying fire. Then I saw it. At the far end of the room, there was a shadow, a figure. It was standing by the window just out of the light. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the shape of something tall hunched over. The figure was still, like it was waiting for something. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, barely breathing, praying I was just seeing things. Suddenly, the figure moved. It shifted toward me, yet its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't fully in control of its body. I froze, unable to move as it came closer. The air grew cold, and the silence in the cabin became suffocating. I could feel the presence of something wrong. Just as the figure was about to reach me, I heard a voice. Not from the figure, but from behind me. A whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. "Don't look back." I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The voice had sounded familiar, almost like my mother's, but it was gone as soon as I heard it. I didn't wait to question it. I ran back down the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I slammed the door to my room shut, locking it behind me. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers over my head, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But I knew deep down it wasn't. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent my mind into a spiral. I kept hearing that whisper, and the image of the figure standing in the living room stayed with me. When morning came, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. But I didn't want to be alone. I needed to be around other people to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I joined the others in the kitchen, where they were making breakfast. They didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. Sarah asked if I was okay, looking concerned, but I just nodded and forced a smile. I didn't want to freak anyone out. I didn't want to seem crazy. We spent the day hiking and exploring the woods. The fresh air helped clear my mind, and for a while, I almost forgot about the fear that had gripped me the night before. But as the sun began to set, that creeping feeling returned. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but I couldn't ignore the unease building in my chest. That night, we decided to stay inside, away from the woods. We played cards and drank, trying to pass the time. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on us. The scratching noise from the night before started again, this time louder, closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I stood up and announced that I was going outside to check the perimeter of the cabin, just to make sure nothing was trying to get in. Mark and Jake both volunteered to come with me, probably to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. We stepped out into the cold night, flashlights in hand. The woods around us were silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. We circled the cabin, checking the windows and doors. There was nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry, no strange marks on the wood. But then, as we turned the corner, we saw it. In the corner of the yard, just at the edge of the forest, was a figure. A tall, thin figure standing perfectly still. Its back was hunched, its arms hanging loosely at its sides. The moonlight reflected off its pale skin, and its eyes, I'll never forget its eyes. Black as the void, empty and hollow. We all froze, the flashlight beams shaking in our hands. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge us. It was like it was waiting for something. And then it whispered, just like the voice I'd heard the night before, "Leave, now." The words sent a jolt of fear through my body. We turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind us. The atmosphere inside was worse now. Heavy, suffocating. We didn't speak. None of us did. We knew we couldn't leave, not at night, not with that thing out there, but we didn't know what else to do. We stayed up all night, watching the windows, listening for any sound. The scratching came back, louder this time, and the whispering, always that whispering, filled the cabin. By dawn, we couldn't take it anymore. We packed up and left, driving as fast as we could, not looking back until we were miles away. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. Was it a ghost? A creature? I'll never be sure. But I know this. Whatever it wasn't human. It followed us, and it won't let us forget.
Next story.
I'll never forget the weekend. My friends and I decided to get away from the city and head into the woods for some peace and quiet. It was supposed to be a short, relaxing break from the hustle and bustle of daily life. None of us knew that it would turn into the most terrifying experience of our lives. We found this cabin online, deep in the Appalachian woods, far from any civilization. The pictures were rustic, cozy, perfect for a weekend retreat. We were promised that it was completely private, no neighbors for miles. When we arrived, the cabin stood isolated and eerie, framed by thick trees that seemed to swallow it whole. It looked older than we expected, the wood darkened and weathered with age, the windows dusty and cracked. Still, it was charming in a way, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie just before something goes horribly wrong. There were 4 of us, me, Sarah, Ben, and Dave. Ben and I were dating, and Sarah and Dave had been best friends since childhood. We'd all been friends for years, so it was easy to slip into the comfort of just being together. But from the moment we stepped up inside the cabin, something felt off. The inside was even darker than I'd anticipated, the air stale with the scent of old wood and mildew. The furniture was sparse, an old leather couch, a worn-out rug, a couple of mismatched chairs. It wasn't exactly the cozy getaway I had imagined. But after hours of driving, we were tired, and the promise of fresh air and seclusion made us push past our discomfort. We spent the first day exploring the surrounding woods, laughing and joking, not really thinking about the strange energy hanging in the air. But as night fell, things started to change. The cabin felt colder than it should, and the darkness outside seemed to press against the windows in a way that was almost suffocating. We were sitting around the fireplace, talking and drinking, when we heard the first noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint creak from somewhere upstairs. At first, we all shrugged it off, figuring it was the house settling. But then we heard it again, followed by what sounded like something dragging across the floor. Ben stood up, eyes wide. "Did you guys hear that?" "Probably just the wind or something," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. But I could tell she was nervous. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened to the strange noises echo through the house. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above us. My heart started pounding, and I glanced at the others. Ben was clearly spooked, his face pale. "Maybe we should check it out," Dave suggested, though his voice trembled slightly. He was usually the brave one, always cracking jokes, but now even he seemed rattled. "I'll go," I volunteered, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You guys stay here? I'll just check it out, make sure nothing's wrong." I grabbed a flashlight from the bag and slowly made my way up the creaky stairs. The house was so silent that every footstep I took felt too loud. When I reached the second floor, I shined the flashlight into the dark hallway. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I walked down the narrow passage. The light flickered, and I swore I saw something move at the far end of the hall. Just a shadow, like someone or something darting behind the wall. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just the stillness of the cabin. I walked further down the hall, each step seeming to drag on forever. When I reached the door at the end of the hall, I turned the handle slowly. It opened with an unsettling squeal, revealing a dusty old bedroom, untouched by time. There were old furniture pieces, a rocking chair that seemed to have a mind of its own, rocking ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. As I stepped inside, the air grew cold. The flashlight's beam flickered again, and for a moment I thought I saw something standing by the window, a figure, barely visible, just out of reach of the light. I blinked, and it was gone. My pulse quickened, and I backed out of the room, feeling as though something was watching me. I hurried back downstairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I entered the living room, I was met with worried faces. "What happened?" Ben asked, his voice tight. I I don't know. It's just a creepy room. I think we should leave." I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. But just as I was about to suggest we pack up and go, the cabin's front door slammed shut with a violent bang. We all jumped, and Dave immediately rushed to the door to try and open it. It wouldn't budge. We pulled, we pushed, but it was as though the door had been sealed shut from the outside. I started to feel a creeping dread, an overwhelming sense that we weren't alone in that cabin, that we never had been. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the attic, followed by what sounded like muffled voices, but they weren't human. The sounds were distorted, like something was trying to speak but couldn't get the words out. Ben grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back door. "Let's get out of here," he said urgently. But when we reached the door, it too was locked, as if something was actively keeping us inside. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice quivering. "We need to leave now." We were all breathing heavily, our eyes wide with fear. The strange noises continued, growing louder and more frantic, as though something or someone was getting closer. Then, from above, we heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. Slow and deliberate, like it had been waiting for us to hear it. "We have to get out," I said, barely able to keep the panic from my voice. But just as I reached for the front door again, a cold, clammy hand grasped my shoulder from behind. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty air, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The temperature in the room dropped, and we could see our breath in the air. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving us in total darkness. The strange whispering filled the air, voices calling from all directions. And then, a figure appeared in front of me. It was tall, thin, and dressed in tattered clothes. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow and black, staring straight into mine. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us. I couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed me. It was Sarah who finally screamed, breaking the trance. Ben grabbed her, and Dave dragged me back toward the stairs, shouting at us to run. But the moment we reached the bottom, the door flew open. Not because we had unlocked it, but because something or someone was allowing it to. We didn't hesitate. We ran out of that cabin, into the woods, not stopping until we found the main road. We flagged down a passing car, desperate to get away. To this day, I still don't know what happened in that cabin. The police found nothing when they checked it out, no signs of anyone being there, no evidence of any kind of supernatural activity. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. And I know that something in those woods, something old, something ancient, is still waiting, watching, always watching.
Next story.
I'll never understand why we decided to go. I don't know what we were thinking, driving so far out into the woods, into a place so isolated that not even a GPS signal could reach. But there we were, 5 friends packed into an old Jeep, heading towards an abandoned cabin deep in the mountains for a weekend getaway. We'd heard the stories, of course, the ones about the cabin being haunted, about strange disappearances, but we laughed it off. After all, what were the chances that any of that could happen to us? We reached the cabin as the sun began to set, the shadows growing long as we unloaded our gear. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The roof had patches missing, and the windows were covered in dust and grime, but it still had that rustic charm. A wooden porch creaked under our feet as we walked inside, the smell of old pine filling the air. It was a little worn, a little decrepit, but it had a certain warmth to it. We set up our things, joking about the stories we'd heard, saying things like, "It'll be fine, just a bunch of old ghost stories." The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, had some drinks, and sat around a fire outside talking and laughing. The air was crisp, and the firelight danced in the trees, casting strange shadows. But around midnight, things started to get off. I was the first to notice it. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and in the distance I thought I saw movement. I strained my eyes, sure I was just imagining things. But there, just at the edge of the tree line, I could make out a figure. It was tall, almost impossibly so, and its outline seemed to shift and distort in the wind. I told myself it was just a trick of the firelight, just some animal in the woods. But the more I looked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I wasn't the only one who felt it. The others were getting restless too. Sarah, one of my closest friends, kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously around the trees. "Do you guys feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like we're not alone." We all laughed it off, but the mood had shifted. The fire suddenly seemed smaller, as if the darkness outside was closing in on us. We decided to head inside for the night, and that's when things started to take a darker turn. The cabin's inside was just as unsettling as the outside. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs of people we didn't recognize. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. But we didn't think much of it at the time. We were all eager to get some sleep, to shake off the unease we'd been feeling. I woke up around 3 a.m., the cabin deathly silent. I could feel it before I even opened my eyes, a strange, oppressive energy in the air, like the room was charged with something I couldn't explain. The darkness was suffocating. I tried to roll over, but my body wouldn't move. It was as though I was paralyzed, unable to lift a finger, trapped in the heavy weight of the night. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. They were heavy, dragging across the floorboards, as if something was moving through the house with purpose. My heart raced, and I forced myself to open my eyes. But when I looked around, there was nothing. The room was still, the others still asleep, and the footsteps had stopped. But I could still feel it. The presence, something just out of sight, lurking in the darkness. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching the shadows twist and stretch in the corners of the room. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The sun was shining through the cracked window, casting a soft light across the room. I got up, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that still clung to me, and went to find the others. We were all unsettled, though no one admitted out loud. We went about our day like nothing had happened, but the tension was palpable. Everyone seemed on edge, avoiding the woods, staying close to the cabin. It was like we were all waiting for something, but none of us wanted to say it. That afternoon, we decided to explore the woods. Sarah was the first to suggest it, hoping to get away from the cabin and the uneasy atmosphere that had settled over us. "Let's just go for a walk," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Get some fresh air." So we ventured into the trees, trying to clear our heads. But the deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The trees seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker, thicker. It wasn't long before we lost track of time, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. We tried to turn back, but everything looked different now. The path that we had taken was gone, swallowed up by the undergrowth. We were lost. We were lost. I've never been so scared in my life. The air grew colder, and the sky above us grew dark with clouds that hadn't been there before. The sounds of the forest had quieted, as though even the animals had gone silent. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl from somewhere ahead. It was deep, primal, and filled with a hatred I can't describe. I looked at the others, and I could see the fear on their faces. None of us spoke, but we all knew. Something was out there. We ran. We ran through the woods without looking back, but it felt like we were being hunted. Every step felt like it took us further from safety, further into the dark heart of the forest. The growling was getting closer, echoing off the trees. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but we couldn't stop. Finally, we stumbled into a clearing and saw the cabin in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the trees. We made it back, but we knew we weren't alone anymore. The growling had stopped, but something else was there. Something we couldn't see, but we could feel it just outside the edges of our vision, watching us. When we got inside, we locked all the doors and windows, but it didn't help. The air in the cabin had changed. It was thick, oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in, and then the whispers started again. Quiet at first, but growing louder, like they were coming from the very floorboards beneath us. We couldn't escape it. We couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting for us to make a mistake, to step outside. That night, none of us slept. We huddled together, trying to keep the terror at bay, but we all knew it was only a matter of time before something would break. I don't remember exactly when it happened, but at some point we heard the unmistakable sound of something scratching at the door. Not the wood, no, this was something else. Something softer, more insidious. It was as though the cabin itself was trying to communicate, trying to tell us something we didn't want to hear. By morning, we couldn't take it anymore. We packed up our things and left, not even bothering to say goodbye to the cabin. We didn't look back as we drove away, and when we finally hit the main road, we stopped to catch our breath. We never talked about what happened that night. Not one of us. But I know what I felt, and I know what we all experienced. I'll never go back to that cabin, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was there, whatever was in the woods, is still out there, waiting for the next group of idiots to wander into its territory.
Next story.
This happened a few years ago, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me back from that trip. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a getaway with a few friends, but it turned into something far darker, something I wish I could forget. It started with a cabin in the woods, far away from the city, where the cell service was spotty and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. My friends and I wanted to disconnect, take a break from our hectic lives. The cabin was old, the kind you see in movies. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, an old rocking chair on the porch that creaked in the wind. The listing said it was secluded and quiet, a perfect place for relaxation. We were sold. The drive there was beautiful. The landscape gradually changed from suburban neighborhoods to winding mountain roads, and then it was just us, a few old trees, and the sound of our tires on the gravel. As we pulled up to the cabin, I noticed that the woods seemed a little too thick, a little too quiet. But I ignored it. We were here to have fun, right? The first day was great. We explored the surrounding woods, played games, cooked, and talked around the campfire. But as the sun set and darkness fell, something felt off. The sounds of the forest grew quieter. No owls hooted, no branches cracked. Even the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. We all noticed it, but we brushed it off as just the peace of being in nature. That night, we went to bed early. I shared a room with my friend Matt, who was passed out before I even climbed into bed. I couldn't sleep, though. I kept hearing creaks, like someone was walking around in the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but it felt wrong, like the sounds were too deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet, but wasn't doing a good job of it. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Or maybe the old house just settling? I turned over and tried to sleep, but then I heard it, a soft tapping coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. I couldn't bring myself to look. It wasn't the wind. No, this was something else. The tapping continued for a few minutes before it stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but the silence felt even worse now. The kind of silence that's thick with something you can't name. I finally mustered the courage to peek out of the window. Nothing. Just the trees in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning I was exhausted, but I didn't tell anyone. I figured it was just nerves, maybe the stress of being out in the middle of nowhere. But then things started to get weird. Little things at first. The doors wouldn't stay closed. I'd wake up to find them slightly ajar, even though I knew I had locked them the night before. The fireplace would flicker even when the logs were burned out, casting strange shadows across the room. On the second night, things escalated. I was sitting on the couch trying to read when I felt eyes on me. I looked up and saw nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. The air felt heavy, thick, like something was watching, waiting. I stood up and walked to the window, thinking I might just need some fresh air, but that's when I saw it. In the distance, just at the edge of the trees, a figure stood. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally still. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But no, this figure was real. It had no distinct features, no details to its face, just a shadowy outline that seemed to blend with the darkness. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly raised a hand and waved, as though it knew I was watching. I slammed the window shut and backed away, my heart racing. I called out for Matt, but when he came downstairs, the figure was gone. Of course, Matt didn't believe me. He said I'd probably imagined it, that it was just the stress of the trip. But I knew what I saw. I could still feel it, the weight of its gaze and the eerie wave that seemed to mock me. That night, things were worse. I could hear whispering, low, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the walls, from under the floorboards. I tried to wake Matt, but he was asleep, breathing deeply, oblivious to the noises that filled the cabin. The whispers became louder, more frantic. I could swear I heard my name, my voice echoing back at me, distorted and wrong. The whispers were joined by other sounds, scraping, like fingernails on wood, and then a thump. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped, and I could feel the floor vibrating with the impact. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, no signal in this place. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I grabbed my things, my jacket, and ran downstairs to find Matt, but when I opened the door to his room, he was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets pulled back, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in. I ran through the cabin, calling his name, but there was no answer. Then I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the attic. I don't know why, but I went upstairs. Maybe I thought I'd find him there, or maybe I thought it was all just a bad dream. But as I opened the attic door, I froze. The air up there was freezing cold, and the light bulb flickered overhead. The room was small, filled with boxes, old furniture, and dust. But in the far corner, Matt was standing, facing the wall, his back to me. I called his name, but he didn't respond. I stepped forward, my foot scraping against the floor, and that's when he turned. His face, his eyes were completely blank, empty. There was nothing in his gaze, no recognition, just an empty stare. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. Then, in a low, guttural voice, Matt whispered, "They're here." I didn't wait to hear anything more. I turned and ran out of the cabin, not even bothering to look back. I bolted through the woods, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks until I reached the road. I didn't stop running until I found a car, flagged it down, and begged the driver to take me to the nearest town. The police never found Matt. They searched the cabin and the woods around it, but there was no sign of him. They said it was probably just a prank or that he had left. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Since that night, I've never gone back to those woods, and I don't think I ever will. But every time I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers, feel the cold touch of those hollow eyes on me, and wonder, is Matt really gone, or did something else take him?
Next story.
I'm not one to believe in ghost stories or supernatural things. I've always been the pragmatic, logical type. But after what happened that weekend, I can't explain it. I can't look at the woods the same way again, and I sure as hell can't forget the cabin. It all started with a friend of mine, Rachel. She was one of those people who always seemed to find hidden gems, places that no one else knew about. So when she found this cabin in the woods, I wasn't surprised. It was secluded, off the grid, and a perfect spot for a group of friends to relax and unwind. There were 6 of us going. Rachel, me, my cousin Daniel, and 3 of our friends, Jake, Hannah, and Will. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The weather was unseasonably warm for the fall, and the trees around the cabin were a mixture of yellow and orange, their leaves hanging on tightly before the coming winter. The cabin itself was old, probably from the 1800s, though it had been renovated at some point. It wasn't big, but it had a rustic charm with its stone fireplace and wood paneling. There was something oddly inviting about it, though I'd later realize that was just part of the trap. The first night went off without a hitch. We had dinner, cracked open a few beers, and sat around the fire, talking and laughing. The only thing that seemed off was a strange, low hum that seemed to come from the woods. But no one really noticed it at first. Maybe it was just the wind or the distant sound of animals. Either way, no one was concerned. It wasn't until late that night, after we'd all gone to bed, that things started to get weird. I woke up around 3 a.m., the kind of wakefulness that wasn't from any noise or disturbance, but just an unsettling feeling. I couldn't shake it. The cabin felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I lay there in the dark, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the rustling sounds outside. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something off about the wind. It felt wrong, like it was too close to the house, as if the forest was pressing in on us. I tried to ignore it, rolling over to check the time on my phone, But before I could even pull the covers back up, I heard it. A soft knock on the bedroom door. I froze. I knew we were all supposed to be asleep, but who would be knocking at this hour? I stayed still, waiting, but it came again. 3 soft knocks. I wasn't about to get up. I'm not the bravest person, and at that moment, I was terrified. I was just about to reach over to wake Rachel. She was the one who'd been the most insistent about this trip when I heard it again. But this time, the knock was followed by a whisper. "Come outside." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. There was no way I was going outside at 3 a.m. No way in hell. I waited a long while, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. And then it came again, closer this time. A faint scraping sound, like nails on wood. I bolted out of bed. I had to check. I wasn't sure why, but something told me I had to. I crept out of my room and into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the stairs. I peered down into the darkness of the living room, hoping I was just hearing things. That's when I saw it. There, standing in the doorway of the living room, was a figure. Not quite a person, not quite a shadow. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch just a bit too long. It was hunched over, its back arched at an impossible angle, and its head tilted as if listening for something. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the floor. It whispered again, barely audible, "Come outside." I don't know how I made it back to my room, but somehow I managed to crawl back into bed, shaking uncontrollably. I pulled the covers up to my neck and closed my eyes, praying that when I opened them again, the figure would be gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the cabin seemed amplified. Every floorboard creak, every gust of wind felt like it was leading up to something, but eventually morning came and the figure was gone. I thought I might be going crazy, so I kept quiet about what happened, but Rachel, being the perceptive one, noticed something was off. I told her everything. The knocking, the figure, the whispering. At first, she just laughed it off. But when I insisted, she grew quiet, her face becoming pale. "I don't know what to say, but we're not the first ones to stay here," she said, her voice shaky. I didn't want to mention it because I didn't want to scare anyone, but I did some research. I stared at her, my mind racing. "Research? What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, avoiding my gaze. "This cabin, it's not just old. People have disappeared here. There are rumors. People who went out into the woods at night and never came back. Some people say they were taken. Some say they left, but no one knows why. And the worst part, the people who stayed behind, they started hearing things, whispering voices, knocking, scratching, just like you described." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I didn't want to believe it, but the fear in Rachel's eyes made it hard to dismiss. "I should have told you earlier," she continued, "but I didn't think it was real. I thought it was just local legend. But now, I don't know." The rest of the day passed in a daze. We tried to act normal, but the tension was thick. As night approached, no one wanted to talk about it, but I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. We ate dinner in silence, the kind of silence that was almost suffocating. That night, I couldn't sleep again. This time, I stayed awake, watching the door, listening for any sound. The wind had picked up, but there was something else, a faint scratching. The same sound I'd heard the previous night. I wasn't going outside this time. I wasn't going anywhere near that door. But then the whispering came. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. It was right next to my ear. "Come outside." I jerked upright, but there was nothing there. Just the dark shadows of the cabin and the soft rustle of the trees outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something waiting for us to step outside. The next morning, we packed up and left. We didn't talk much during the drive home. We didn't have to. We all knew that whatever had been in that cabin, whatever had been calling us out into the woods, wasn't something we could explain. We didn't want to know. But even now, years later, I still hear the whispers sometimes, just faintly in the back of my mind, as if calling me back. I don't think we were the first to hear it, and I don't think we'll be the last.
Next story.
We were supposed to be on a break, a few days away from the stress of life, a chance to recharge. A cabin in the mountains, far from anything or anyone. Just me, my wife Emily, and our 2 kids. Charlie, who was 14, and Ellie, who was 9. We had rented the cabin through an online service, and the pictures made it look like a perfect getaway. Isolated, cozy, surrounded by towering pines and pristine mountain air. We didn't think anything could go wrong. But by the time we left, I realized that not all escapes from reality are meant to be. We arrived in the early afternoon. The cabin was older than I expected, the wood darkened with age, the roof slanted at odd angles. It was tucked into the base of a mountain with the forest surrounding it like a natural fortress. The moment we stepped out of the car, I had an odd feeling in my chest, a tightness I couldn't explain. I chalked it up to the drive, the unfamiliar place, and brushed it off. The inside of the cabin was rustic, definitely older than the pictures let on, but there was a charm to it. It had that lived-in, comfortable feeling, though the musty scent of wood and old furniture filled the air. We were excited to be there, and Emily insisted we should explore the woods right away. Charlie and Ellie ran ahead, eager to break away from the confines of the cabin. I followed them, but as I walked deeper into the woods, I started feeling something I couldn't quite shake, a strange sensation that I was being watched. Not by any animals, but something more deliberate. It made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it. I was a grown man, after all. But the deeper we went, the more intense that feeling became. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that I realized we were not alone. The kids were playing near a fallen log, picking at the moss, when I saw it, just out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. I froze. It was tall, but its outline was too vague to make out any details. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted as though watching us. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. Just like that, as if it had never been there. I didn't say anything to Emily, but I felt uneasy for the rest of the day. The kids noticed nothing, and when I asked them if they had seen anything strange, they looked at me like I was crazy. I tried to push it out of my mind, but that evening something happened that made it impossible to ignore. After dinner, we were gathered in the living room, talking and laughing, when the power went out. I stood up to check the fuse box, thinking it was just a blown circuit. But when I opened the basement door, the air hit me like a wall. It was ice cold, and the stairs leading down were shrouded in darkness. I had a flashlight in my hand, but I hesitated before going down. I don't know why, but something about the basement made me feel like I shouldn't be there. But I had no choice. I had to check it. The kids were nervous, and Emily was trying to keep them calm. As I stepped into the basement, I felt the temperature drop even further. My breath fogged in the air. The flashlight flickered. The basement was large, with shelves full of old boxes, bags, and odd furniture that hadn't been touched in years. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. There was a door at the far end of the basement, a door I hadn't noticed when we arrived. It was small, hidden behind a shelf, almost like it was deliberately kept out of sight. The handle was old, the wood warped. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, but it wasn't locked. Something inside me told me I shouldn't open it, but I was already too far in. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. When I turned it, the door creaked open slowly, as if protesting. What I saw behind it made my blood run cold. The room was small, with walls that looked like they had been hastily constructed. It wasn't a part of the original cabin. It felt like something added on. And in the center of the room was a single, large mirror. It was old, the frame dark and ornate, but the glass, it wasn't reflecting anything. It was black, solid, impenetrable black, as though there was nothing on the other side. It was like staring into a void. I stepped closer, almost drawn to it, when I heard Emily calling my name from upstairs. I snapped out of my trance, backing away from the mirror, and shut the door behind me. The power came back on shortly after, and the rest of the evening passed uneventfully. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That mirror, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept telling myself it was just an old house, that I was being paranoid. But I knew deep down, there was something about that mirror that I didn't understand. That night, when we went to bed, things only got worse. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. I froze, my eyes wide in the dark. At first, I thought it was one of the kids, or maybe Emily, but then I heard it again. Closer this time. I grabbed my phone, shivering, and crept out of bed. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the cabin. The house felt different now. strange, unsettled, like it was holding its breath. I walked toward the source of the sound, the basement. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my feet moved of their own accord. When I reached the door to the basement, it was ajar. The chill from below rushed up the stairs, sending a wave of dread through me. I descended into the dark again, the flashlight in my hand trembling. The basement felt colder than before, the air thick and oppressive. The door to the small room was wide open. The mirror was gone. I didn't know how it had happened or when, but it was gone, leaving behind nothing but the empty room. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran upstairs, waking Emily. She tried to calm me down, asking if I was dreaming, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The next morning, I packed up our things and told Emily we were leaving. She protested, but there was no way I was staying there another night. We left that morning, driving down the mountain, away from the cabin and whatever was in it. But as we passed the road leading up to the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I saw it. The reflection wasn't just the road behind us. It was the cabin, standing tall against the forest, and inside one of the windows, just barely visible, was a dark figure standing there, watching us. And I knew then that whatever was in that cabin hadn't let us go. It was still following us, and it always would.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts. At least I didn't until the night we went to the cabin in the woods. Now, I'm not so sure about anything anymore. It all started when my friends and I were looking for a place to disconnect from everything. No cell service, no distractions. Just a weekend in the woods to unwind. We found an old cabin on a remote property in Maine, nestled in a valley that no one seemed to visit. The owner was an old man who'd promised it was quiet, isolated, and perfect for a getaway. We were sold. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin wasn't the picturesque, charming one I imagined. It was falling apart. The roof was sagging in one corner, the windows had a cloudy, cracked look to them, and the porch had rotted wood that creaked underfoot. But hey, we were here for the adventure, not the luxury. There were 5 of us. Me, my brother Jake, his girlfriend Lily, my best friend Max, and his cousin Ellie. We were all excited, laughing, unloading the car, and ignoring the creeping feeling that something was off. The sun was setting by the time we got inside, and the light that filtered through the grimy windows made everything look even older and more worn. We unpacked, started a fire in the stone fireplace, and settled in. After a while, we were enjoying the peace and quiet, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and pine. But as the darkness of the night crept in, things started to feel different. I was the first one to notice it. At first, it was just a sound, soft, almost like a whisper. I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. Someone calling my name. Anna. Anna. It was faint, like the wind was carrying it, but the voice wasn't right. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. I looked around the room, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine, but no one else seemed to have noticed. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Max, who was lounging in the corner, looked at me like I was crazy. "Hear what?" I frowned, unsure if I was imagining things. Never mind. I tried to brush it off, but as the night went on, the feeling only grew stronger. The sound of whispering came and went, like it was coming from the walls. Occasionally, I'd catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye, darting across the room. I'd turn to look, and of course, nothing would be there. That's when things took a darker turn. Jake and Lily were the first ones to go upstairs. They claimed they were tired and wanted to sleep early, but it wasn't long before we heard them yelling, their voices filled with panic. Ellie and Max rushed up, and I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. When we reached the top of the stairs, Jake and Lily were standing by the bedroom door looking wide-eyed and terrified. "The door won't open," Lily cried, her hand on the handle, struggling to turn it. We tried to help them, all of us pulling and pushing, but it was like something was on the other side, holding it shut. After what felt like forever, the door suddenly flew open with a loud bang, sending us all stumbling back. The room inside was freezing. I mean, freezing in a way that didn't make sense. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, was an old rocking chair. It was moving, slowly rocking back and forth as though someone was sitting in it, though the chair was empty. What the hell? Max whispered, his voice trembling. How is that moving on its own? But I didn't hear him. My attention was drawn to something else, a mirror on the wall. It wasn't like any mirror I had ever seen. The glass was dark and foggy, and the reflection didn't match the room at all. The furniture was wrong, the walls were a different color, and the shadows in the reflection twisted unnaturally. I couldn't look away. I felt drawn to it, like it was calling me. Anna, what's going on? Ellie asked, her voice shaky. I turned to look at her, but when I did, I saw it, a figure, standing behind her in the mirror. It was tall and hunched over, its face a pale blur of shadow. It wasn't real, but it felt real. I could feel its presence like it was standing right behind me. I couldn't breathe. Anna! Ellie grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. What's wrong? I jerked away from her, stumbling backward. We need to get out of here, now. We didn't waste any time. We bolted down the stairs, rushing out of the cabin into the freezing night air. But the moment we stepped outside, the silence hit us. There was no sound, no wind, no rustling of trees, no crickets, just absolute stillness. Max pulled out his phone, but there was no service. No one could get a signal. We debated what to do next, but before we could make a plan, the lights inside the cabin flickered. The door creaked open, though no one was near it. Then I heard it again. The voice. Louder this time. Anna. It was coming from the woods. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab everyone and just get out of there, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone. The voice wasn't just calling my name. It was familiar. It was almost like a memory, like something buried deep in my mind. Suddenly, there was a crash from inside the cabin. It sounded like something large had fallen over. We all spun toward the door, but nothing was there. Nothing, except for the same emptiness. I don't know what happened after that. My memory gets fuzzy. All I remember is waking up in the car with Max driving, looking pale and frantic. We didn't talk about it much after we left. We couldn't explain what happened. The others tried to convince themselves it was just the isolation, the nerves. But I knew the truth. There was something in that cabin, something ancient and malevolent that didn't want us there. I don't go near the woods anymore. I don't even want to think about it. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet, when the air is still, I swear I hear it. The voice calling my name, and I wonder if it ever really left.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a fun weekend trip, a chance for my friends and I to get away from everything. No phones, no work, just a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. We were all so excited when we found the place. Tucked deep in the woods of upstate New York, the cabin looked like it came out of an old postcard. Rustic, charming, the kind of place you'd find in a cozy mystery novel. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Connolly, had been more than kind in her emails, and she'd assured us the place was perfect for a peaceful retreat. We didn't think much about the warning she slipped into her last message. It was a little odd, something about how the property wasn't for everyone, but we shrugged it off, thinking she was just being cautious. I should have listened. There were 4 of us, me, Kate, Lucas, and Ben. We'd been friends for years, and this trip was meant to be a bonding experience. The drive out there was long but uneventful, and by the time we arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. It had a faded charm, the wood gray with age, the stone steps worn and uneven. Still, it was peaceful, isolated, exactly what we wanted. We unloaded our stuff, settled in, and began to unpack. Kate and I claimed the 2 bedrooms upstairs, while Lucas and Ben took the one on the ground floor. The air was cool, the scent of pine filling the air. The woods around us were dense, like something out of a fairy tale. That night, we all sat around the fireplace, telling stories and playing cards. It was all fun and games until it got late, and the fire started to die down. That's when things took a turn. We were chatting idly when we heard something outside, something that didn't belong. It was soft at first, like footsteps, but not quite. It was as though something was dragging itself across the ground, a slow, deliberate shuffle. Ben got up to check, laughing it off. Probably a deer or something, he said, pulling on his jacket. We waited, listening, but Ben never came back. After a few minutes, Kate stood up, a nervous look crossing her face. Ben, everything okay? There was no answer. We all got up and headed for the door, the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Outside, the night was thick with darkness. The trees towered over us, their branches swaying in the wind. But there was no sign of Ben. We walked around the cabin calling his name, but then something strange happened. It was like the forest had gone completely still. The air grew thick as if it were holding its breath. Even the wind had stopped. There was no rustling of leaves, no sound of animals, just the oppressive silence. It was Lucas who spotted him first. He was standing by the edge of the forest, just beyond the light cast by the cabin's porch, staring into the darkness. His back was to us. "Ben?" Kate called out, her voice shaking. "What are you doing?" Ben didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge us. His head was slightly tilted as if he was listening to something or someone just beyond the trees. "Ben!" I called again, my heart pounding. He finally turned around, but when he did, something was wrong. His eyes were wide, unblinking, but his face was pale, like he hadn't been in the sunlight for days. His lips were cracked, and his expression, it wasn't him. He looked hollow. "What's wrong with you?" Lucas asked, stepping forward. Ben didn't respond. He just stared at us, his eyes flickering back toward the forest. Slowly, he began to walk away, his steps stiff and unsteady. "Ben, stop!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. I grabbed his arm, but his skin was cold, unnaturally cold, and when I touched him, it felt like there was something else beneath his flesh, something that didn't belong. Ben jerked away from me, a sound escaping from his throat that I can only describe as a low growl. It wasn't human. Then he ran. We chased after him, shouting, but he was too fast. He disappeared into the woods, his form swallowed by the darkness. It felt like we were running through thick, invisible mud, the air pressing in on us, making it harder to breathe. Eventually we stopped. Gasping for air, we turned back toward the cabin, unsure of what to do. The stillness of the forest around us made my skin crawl. It was like something was watching us, waiting. We didn't find Ben that night. The next morning, after a restless, fitful sleep, we tried to stay calm. We searched the woods for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His clothes, his phone, everything was left behind in the cabin. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. That afternoon, we finally decided to call the local authorities, though deep down, we all knew something wasn't right. The sheriff who arrived was an older man with a solemn face. He had heard of Mrs. Connolly's cabin before, and when we mentioned it, his expression darkened. "I've been meaning to go out there," he muttered, looking at the woods with suspicion. "There's talk about that place. Strange things happen out there." "What do you mean?" Kate asked, her voice tight with worry. The sheriff didn't answer at first. He just stared out at the trees, as if the answer was hidden among the branches. Finally, he said, "That land was never meant to be settled. A long time ago, there were rumors about the people who lived out there, people who vanished without a trace. And some say the forest, it remembers." We didn't ask him to elaborate. We didn't want to know. As the sheriff left to continue the search, we gathered our things and made a decision. We weren't going to wait around. Ben was gone, and whatever was out there in those woods had taken him. We couldn't stay another night. The drive back felt like an eternity. But as we passed the last stretch of trees, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I turned to look more closely, I saw him. Ben. He was standing at the edge of the woods, his face twisted in that same hollow expression, his eyes wide and unblinking, just like the night before. But this time, he wasn't looking at us. He was looking at something else, something behind us. Before I could say anything, he disappeared back into the trees, vanishing as if he were never there. We didn't go back, none of us. We left and never spoke of it again. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that dragging sound. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something is walking in the woods, calling my name.
Next story.
I've never told anyone this, not the full version. I've told pieces of it, sure. The parts where I was scared out of my mind, where I could explain away the odd things that happened, but the whole truth? No. That's something I can't even say out loud. What I experienced in that cabin, I still can't fully understand. It all started when my cousin James invited me to spend the weekend with him in a remote cabin. We hadn't seen each other in years, and he'd recently come into some money. Deciding to celebrate, he rented this old cabin in the middle of nowhere, up in the mountains. The kind of place that only the locals knew about. The kind of place you didn't find unless you were looking for it. I figured it would be a chance to reconnect, have some drinks, maybe do some fishing or hiking. The drive was long, winding through forests that seemed to stretch on forever. As we neared the cabin, the trees thickened, casting deep shadows on the road. I remember thinking that it felt like we were leaving the real world behind, like we were entering something different. But I didn't dwell on it. James was in high spirits, talking nonstop about his new job, the money, and the things he wanted to do next. When we arrived, the cabin was exactly what I expected. It was small, rustic, with wooden beams and a stone chimney. The view was stunning. From the porch, you could see miles of untouched forest and rolling hills, but the place had an air of abandonment, like it had been left there for a long time, untouched by time. I didn't think much of it, though. The whole point was to escape, right? A few days away from everything. We unpacked, and the first few hours were fine. We set up a fire in the living room, made dinner, cracked open a few beers, but as night fell, there was something different about the place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt like we were being watched, like the woods outside the cabin were pressing in on us, getting closer with every passing second. James didn't seem to notice. He was too busy talking about his plans, his excitement about being in such a secluded place. I tried to push the feeling away, told myself it was just the isolation. But that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear something. A low scratching sound, like claws dragging across wood. It was faint at first, but it grew louder until it was all I could hear. The walls creaked with every gust of wind, and the fireplace crackled and popped like it was alive. I kept telling myself it was the house settling. But then the whispering started. It wasn't loud, just faint murmurs, like someone was talking just out of reach. I tried to ignore it. The darkness in the cabin seemed to press against me, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. It was as though the darkness itself had a life of its own. I finally sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and looked around. James was still asleep in his chair, his head tilted back. But the shadows, they weren't just shadows. They were moving, writhing like something alive. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but they didn't go away. And then just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The shadows froze. The cabin went deathly still. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I stepped out onto the porch, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. The forest outside was as still as the cabin. No wind, no sound, just silence. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out into the dark trees. But when I turned back to the cabin, I saw something that I can't explain. In the window where the light should have been off, there was a shadow. It wasn't James. I knew that much. It was tall, hunched over, and it didn't move. It just stood there, staring out at me. My heart stopped. I felt like I was being suffocated, trapped in some invisible vice. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I rushed back inside, grabbed my stuff, and shook James awake. "We need to leave. Now," I said, my voice shaking. He groggily protested, but when he saw the panic on my face, he didn't argue. We packed quickly and ran out to the truck. But as we were about to leave, something stopped us. There, at the edge of the forest, standing just beyond the trees, was a figure. A man, tall and thin, with a face so pale it looked like it had never seen the sun. His eyes, they were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just black, empty voids. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us. James started the truck, his hands shaking as he tried to get the engine to turn over. But before we could leave, I heard something, whispering again. It was coming from the woods, from the direction of the figure. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. The worst part? When we told the locals what had happened, they weren't surprised. They just nodded and gave us that look. The one that says, "You should have known better." They said the cabin was abandoned for a reason, that it had been built over old ground, and that no one stayed there for long. I asked them about the figure, about what it was, but they just shook their heads. James and I haven't spoken much about that trip since. I can tell that he knows something's wrong, but he's trying to forget it, just like I am. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that figure in the woods, those black eyes staring at me, and I hear the whispers, growing louder, calling me back to the cabin.